Okay, so imagine you are the BBC, 103 years old, a British national institution, funded by every household that watches television in the UK, legally required by your charter to be impartial. And you are producing a documentary about Donald Trump days before the 2024 US presidential election. A documentary titled Trump a Second Chance. And in that documentary, you take Trump's January 6, 2021 speech, the one he gave before the Capitol riot, and you edit it, not just trim it for time. You splice together 3 quotes from 2 different sections, delivered almost an hour apart, and present them as one continuous quote, where Trump urged supporters to march with him and, quote, fight like hell. Among the parts you cut out, the section where Trump explicitly said he wanted supporters to demonstrate peacefully. Now that edit gets broadcast, days later, Trump wins the election. Months pass. The edit becomes a major controversy. Your chairman calls it an error of judgment. Your CEO resigns. Your head of news resigns. You apologize to Trump. And then Trump sues you for $10 billion. Not $1 billion, $10 billion. Accusing you of defamation, deceptive trade practices, and brazenly attempting to interfere in a U.S. presidential election. Welcome to the most expensive documentary edit in media history. Now here is what makes this story fascinating beyond just the dollar amount. This isn't about whether you like Trump or hate him. This isn't about whether January 6th was an insurrection or a protest. This is about something more fundamental. When a news organization edits someone's speech, splices together quotes from different parts delivered an hour apart, and presents them as one continuous statement while removing context that changes the meaning, is that journalism? Or is that fabrication? And if it is fabrication, what happens when the fabrication affects an election, damages someone's reputation, and gets broadcast by one of the world's most trusted news organizations? Those questions matter regardless of your politics, because if it is okay to do this to Trump, it is okay to do it to anyone. And once you've established that editing speeches to create false impressions is acceptable journalism, you've destroyed the line between reporting what happened and creating what you wish had happened. So today I want to break down exactly what the BBC did, why their own leadership called it an error, serious enough to trigger multiple resignations, what Trump's lawsuit actually alleges, why he is filing in Florida instead of the UK, whether a $10 billion damages claim is remotely realistic, and what this case reveals about the relationship between media organizations, political power, and the increasingly blurry line between reporting and advocacy. Because by the end, you are going to understand this isn't really about one documentary. It is about whether traditional media institutions can survive in an era where their edits can be compared against source footage instantly, where their credibility is already near historic lows, and where the people they've spent years attacking finally have the resources and willingness to fight back through courts, rather than just press releases. Let's walk through exactly what happened, because the details matter enormously. On January 6, 2021, Trump gave a speech at the Ellipse near the White House. The speech lasted roughly an hour. During that speech, Trump said many things. He talked about election fraud claims. He encouraged supporters to march to the Capitol. He said they needed to fight like hell. And he also explicitly said, quote, I know that everyone here will soon be marching over to the Capitol building to peacefully and patriotically make your voices heard. That word, peacefully, that is direct from the transcript. It is not disputed. Trump said it. The BBC documentary took quotes from early in the speech and quotes from late in the speech, spliced them together to create what appeared to be one continuous statement, and in doing so removed the peacefully language. The result made it look like Trump was unambiguously calling for violence, when the full context of his actual words included explicit calls for peaceful demonstration. Now you might say, okay, but Trump also said fight like hell. That sounds violent. And that is a fair point. But fight like hell is standard political rhetoric used by both parties. Democrats have said fight like hell countless times about various issues. The phrase alone doesn't prove incitement. What changes the meaning is whether peaceful language was also present. If Trump said both fight like hell and peacefully demonstrate, then the speech becomes ambiguous, open to interpretation, with language that could be read multiple ways. But if you edit out the peaceful part and only show fight like hell, you've transformed an ambiguous speech into an unambiguous call for violence. That is not reporting what Trump said. That is creating a version of what he said that fits your narrative. And that is exactly what the lawsuit alleges the BBC did intentionally. The BBC initially defended the edit, arguing it was for time and clarity. But then internal pressure mounted, external criticism intensified, and eventually BBC chairman Samir Shah called it an error of judgment. That is corporate speak for, we screwed up badly. Shortly after, Davie, the BBC's Director General, and Deborah Turness, the head of BBC News, both resigned. Those aren't junior positions. Those are the top executive and top news leadership of one of the world's largest news organizations. People at that level don't resign over minor editing disputes. They resign when something went so fundamentally wrong that their continued presence would damage the institution. The fact that both resigned tells you BBC's internal assessment was that this wasn't defensible. They knew the edit created a false impression. They knew it affected an election, and they knew once people compared the documentary footage to the source speech, the manipulation would be obvious. So they apologized, leadership resigned, and they hoped that would be enough. Trump apparently disagrees, hence the $10 billion lawsuit. Now let's talk about the actual lawsuit, because the legal strategy here is interesting and reveals a lot about Trump's thinking. The case was filed in Florida, not in British courts. Why? Because the deadline to bring defamation claims in the UK expired more than a year ago. British law has very short statute of limitations periods for defamation, typically 1 year from publication. The documentary aired in 2024. It is now late 2025. That window is closed. So Trump can't sue in the UK, even though that is where the BBC is based, and where the documentary primarily aired. But the lawsuit argues us courts have jurisdiction, because the BBC's content, including the Panorama documentary series, is available in the United States through BritBox, a subscription streaming platform. That is the jurisdictional hook. The BBC created content, distributed it in the US via streaming. Therefore, US courts can hear defamation claims related to that content. Now will that argument work? That is debatable. Legal experts point out the documentary wasn't broadcast on US television. It was only available through a subscription service that relatively few Americans use. The connection to the US market is pretty thin, but Trump's lawyers are betting they can establish minimum contacts sufficient for jurisdiction. And Florida, specifically, is strategic. Florida courts are generally more conservative, more likely to be sympathetic to Trump, and Florida defamation law is more plaintiff-friendly than some other states. So if you are Trump's legal team and you are forum shopping for the best venue, Florida makes sense. The lawsuit alleges 3 main claims. First, defamation, that the edited speech created a false and damaging impression of what Trump said. Second, deceptive trade practices, arguing the BBC engaged in unfair business practices by misleading viewers. Third, election interference, claiming the broadcast was timed and designed to influence the 2024 presidential election by making Trump look like he incited violence. That third claim is particularly interesting because it shifts this from a private dispute about reputation to a public concern about election integrity. If you can prove a foreign media organization deliberately manipulated content to affect a U.S. election, that is not just defamation, that is potentially a much more serious issue involving foreign interference. Now, proving intent is hard. The BBC will argue the edit was for time, that it wasn't malicious, that they made an error in judgment, but not an intentional effort to distort. But Trump has some strong evidence working for him. The timing, days before the election, the specific quotes chosen, removing peaceful while keeping fight like hell. The fact that BBC's own leadership couldn't defend the edit and resigned. Those facts suggest this wasn't just sloppy journalism. It was editorial decision-making that created a false narrative. Whether a court will call that defamation actionable under U.S. law is a separate question. But Trump clearly believes he has a case worth pursuing. So let's address the elephant in the room. $10 billion. Is that remotely realistic? Or is this just Trump being Trump, throwing around a huge number for attention and negotiating leverage? To understand that number, you need to understand how defamation damages work. There are 3 types. Actual damages, compensation for concrete harm you can prove. Lost income, business opportunities. Medical costs from emotional distress, quantifiable losses. Reputational damages, compensation for harm to your reputation, even if you can't point to specific lost income. And punitive damages, meant to punish the defendant and deter future misconduct. For a public figure, like Trump, actual damages are hard to prove. He is already wealthy. He won the election despite the BBC edit. So it is tough to argue he lost income or opportunities because of this specific broadcast. Reputational damages are also tricky because Trump's reputation was already highly polarized before this documentary. People who love him weren't swayed by the BBC edit. People who hate him already believe the worst. So where does 10 billion come from? The lawsuit argues the BBC is a massive organization with annual revenue of billions of pounds, that their broadcast reaches hundreds of millions of people globally, and that the harm to Trump's reputation from being falsely portrayed as inciting violence is incalculable. They're also likely building in punitive damages based on the argument that the BBC acted with actual malice, knowing the edit was misleading, and did it anyway to affect an election. If you can prove actual malice, punitive damages can be massive, sometimes multiples of actual damages. So the theory would be even if actual damages are modest, punitive damages could be enormous because the BBC is wealthy, the conduct was egregious, and you want to send a message that this kind of manipulation won't be tolerated. Now, will Trump actually get 10 billion? Almost certainly not, even if he wins the case, which is far from certain. Damages awards of that size almost never survive appeals. Courts typically reduce them as excessive, but starting at 10 billion gives Trump negotiating room. If the case settles for 100 million, or even 10 million, that is a massive victory for him and a massive cost to the BBC. And there is a psychological component here. Trump is signaling to other media organizations that if you manipulate footage of him, if you edit his speeches to create false impressions, he will sue for astronomical amounts. Even if he never collects 10 billion, the threat of a $10 billion lawsuit is enough to make editors think twice before doing similar edits. It is lawfare as deterrence, and it might be effective. Media organizations are already under financial pressure, dealing with declining trust, facing increasing legal challenges. Adding the risk of massive defamation suits makes aggressive editing riskier. Whether that is good for journalism or bad depends on your perspective. If you think media organizations need to be more careful about accuracy, this is positive accountability. If you think this will chill legitimate investigative reporting, it is dangerous intimidation. So what does all this actually mean beyond just Trump versus the BBC? It means we're entering an era where the relationship between politicians and media is fundamentally changing. For decades, the model was media organizations had enormous power. They could edit, frame, contextualize stories however they wanted, and the subjects of their reporting had limited recourse. You could complain, you could issue corrections, requests, but actually holding media accountable through legal action was rare and expensive. That is changing. Trump has money and lawyers and willingness to fight. He has demonstrated with this lawsuit and many others that he'll use courts aggressively against media organizations he believes wronged him. And he is not alone. Other wealthy individuals and organizations are doing the same. Media companies are facing more defamation suits, more legal challenges, more scrutiny of their editorial processes than ever before. And technology is accelerating this shift. In the past, if a news organization edited your speech, most viewers would never see the original source footage. They'd trust the news organization's version. Now anyone can find the full speech online, compare it to the edited version, and see exactly what was cut. That makes manipulative editing much riskier because it is easily exposed. The BBC probably assumed most viewers wouldn't check the original January 6th speech against their documentary. They assumed their reputation would carry them. They were wrong. People did check. The discrepancy was obvious, and once exposed, the BBC couldn't defend it. Their own leadership had to resign. That is the new reality for media. Your edits will be scrutinized, your choices will be compared against source material. And if you are caught creating false narratives, you'll face consequences beyond just bad publicity. Now here is the uncomfortable question that this raises. If the BBC, one of the most respected news organizations in the world, with a charter requiring impartiality, with a 103-year reputation for credibility, if they would edit a speech this blatantly to create a false impression days before an election, what are less reputable organizations doing? If the BBC couldn't resist the temptation to manipulate footage to fit their narrative about Trump, how much manipulation is happening at organizations with lower standards, less oversight, and more explicit political agendas? The answer is probably a lot. And that should concern everyone, regardless of politics. Because if you can't trust that the speech you are watching is what the person actually said, if quotes are being spliced from different contexts to create false impressions, then video evidence loses meaning. We enter a post-truth environment where everything is suspect and nothing is trusted. The BBC's edit and Trump's $10 billion response is a warning. Media credibility is collapsing, and the organizations haven't figured out how to stop it.